Class. Okay, this is Holly Ulbrich, co-president of League of Women Voters, and I'm here to share with you the story of our newly published book about the 100-year history of the South Carolina League of Women Voters in time for the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the League of Women Voters. With me today are my two friends, Sheila Haney and Laura Walliver. Sheila is the person who did all the research and wrote the first draft of the book and had lots of really great ideas about what it was supposed to be. Just wonderful work, lots of research there. And she's going to tell you her story about the making of the book. I came on as editor and project manager back in December, and it took until May to get it ready for publication. And we had lots of other people who helped us. People who reviewed, people who proofread, people who contributed information and chapters, just too many to thank. But I do want to thank Laura Walliver because Laura is here in her capacity as president of the Columbia League, but also as a past faculty member in political science and women's studies at the University of South Carolina, and she reviewed the book. So Sheila's going to tell you about making of the book, Laura is going to tell you about her impressions of the book, and then I'll tell you how to buy the book. So Sheila, you go first.
Thank you so much. And really, this is always a team effort. Is all on, ready to go? We're okay? Great. I want to hold up a book which is entitled, some of you will recognize it, Proud Heritage. When I came in as league president in 2005 through 2007, the history stopped. 1977 was the publication date here. And I thought, mercy, we need to continue that. In the century we now find ourselves in, its league history stopped. So as president, I vowed that when I got that done, I would move into rather an urgent position of getting things together and writing the rest of the history. I will tell you, I tried to get a student who was unable to do it on the USC campus, health problems. The book is dedicated to her, but virtually many people, librarians. I made a recent trip the last fall to USC Library to get photos, and separate, but on our league website is a battery of photos. It is a proud heritage. We're going to keep it going thanks to everybody who is similarly imbued with the spirit. So the book writing began 13 years ago. It traveled with my husband and I around the world multiple times. I could go into more detail in a speaking meeting, but it really has seen many borders, many countries, and even flown in hazardous areas with its author and her husband. The composition, again, I want to share, absorbs this previous history. So it's a continuation up to this year, this great centennial year, representing the 19th Amendment and much that we see on television and we view through the League auspices. I would tell you that the writing of it was based on the South Carolina voter. I had interviews, I transcribed those from 5 leaders. There were helps. I can't tell you how many times I was visited by individuals or called. Keller Barron was one of those continuous in touch with people. But there were many others who helped make this possible. And Holly alluded to those, including herself, which at this point she's very, very important in this production. I am told, having received 10 copies, that this will become the intended cover. Right now we have something that looks quite different, white boots and so forth. So I look forward to that correction. And I do have copies. I think one of the things we might all be cognizant of is that our local leagues need to have a copy. There needs to be a book study and discussion. The sale of the book, it has various ranges, and I know Holly will go into this. You can buy it as a league cheaper and receive multiple copies, but again, the details are what she will share. So it's going to be available. It needs to be kept alive, especially this year, which focuses on women's rights and voting. And it's just propitious. This is the time to do it. I may have some other things in the writing of it that I could share. I took a lunch every Friday, which was meatingless day. And I went to Columbia, became close friends with the librarians there, took my lunch so that I would have a full day. I moved from tablet writing to laptop. Hooray! Eventually, you know, got that together. But it has been the hard way through much of this preparation. It takes a bullheaded woman and other bullheaded women who say, we're not going to let this drop. And so the book itself has just been published, just come out, but it represents the labors of many over time.
Thank you, Sheila. And Sheila had some great ideas about how to organize it. Each of the chapters has one of those women in whose shoes we are walking. Harriet Simons, who led us through desegregation. Eulalie Sally, who has a great story about they were looking for a volunteer to ride an airplane about 1920, and she volunteered and rode on the wing and dropped leaflets about the League in Aiken. Women like Sarah Leverett, who just knew everything about state government, and Mary Kelly, who was an avid environmentalist. Just some really heroic women that shaped the League of Women Voters. So I'm going to turn now to Laura Walliver to tell us what she thinks about the book and why you should read it. Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to read the book ahead of its publication and to think about it and reflect on it in a review fashion. So I want to go over the book in three different domains. First of all, I want to talk about the context in which the League operated from 1920 to 2020. Then I want to turn to the structural and long-term reforms that the League spent most of its time on, as opposed to what a lot of groups have to do, which is just do Band-Aid kind of help mitigation efforts. The League often spent its time on structural change. And then third, I want to talk about race and the League of Women Voters in South Carolina. Now, the first thing I want to mention is the milieu in which the League of Women Voters of South Carolina worked from 1920 especially until 2020. You have to, when you look at citizens groups and activists and volunteer organizations, think about if you're going to measure what they were able to achieve, what they won, you must measure it against what was possible. And in South Carolina in 1920, think about it. A group like the League of Women Voters went directly against the grain of everything that was considered a given in South Carolina politics and culture and society and policymaking at that time. First of all, they went against the gender norms that women should be seen and not heard, and that if women spoke up, there was a problem with that. They went against sometimes, but they had to work within the structures of deep social class tensions and prejudices in South Carolina. And also they worked within the dynamics of the Jim Crow system that was reinstituted in South Carolina in about 1890 and was entrenched, deeply entrenched, baked in South Carolina when the League started. So they also finally had to deal with the very undemocratic structure of South Carolina at the time. So let me talk about some of the structural things that the League spent its time on. There are things that citizens groups can do that are ameliorative. Okay, they ease problems, they mitigate pain and suffering, they feed the poor, and it is wonderful work. Other groups try to figure out how you can prevent people from being hungry, okay? And those are different kinds of organizations, and sometimes the organization does both things. They will mitigate problems, but also try to figure out how to change the situation to structurally make it different in the future. The League of Women Voters, when I read this book, I was struck by how many times the League of Women Voters concentrated concerted efforts for decades at a time on certain issues. For example, constitutional reform in South Carolina. South Carolina had a very antiquated and undemocratic, with a small d, good old boy constitution when the League of Women Voters started looking at the Constitution and thinking about constitutional reform. Ethics reform. Okay, a lot of the problems in many governments, including in South Carolina, come from a lack of ethics, standards in political bodies. The League of Women Voters has worked on ethics reform throughout its 100-year history. And then the League of Women Voters has looked at public education, not just raising money for schools or supporting schools, but looking at the structural way that education is funded in South Carolina. And in certain parts of the 100-year history of the League of Women Voters, the League really stood up and made a huge difference in a change in the funding for public education from K through 12. With public education, you brush up against the topic of social class and also race. And the League of Women Voters, in a lot of its policymaking, understood that all of these issues, gender, race, social class, and eventually sexual differences and sexual diversity, are intertwined. So the League of Women Voters, with its education reforms, brushed up against race discrimination right after the Brown decisions, Brown 1 and Brown 2. After those decisions, the state of South Carolina went into full resistance mode, that they would not comply and that they would close its public schools first before they would permit any kind of integration. The League of Women Voters, right during that very difficult time in South Carolina politics, stood up and said it would be wrong to close the schools, and what should happen is the schools stay open and the communities work together to integrate the schools. This, I'm sure, was not a very popular position for these women in the 1950s and early 1960s. The other thing that they worked on for decades were issues like getting women on juries, very fundamental to fair justice systems, and environmental issues. On environmental issues, it is amazing how prophetic the League of Women Voters was. They worked on environmental issues when no one else, or seemingly a few people, just a few people, thought this was not the most wonderful idea I've ever heard of. The Savannah River site, toxic waste dumps as a mechanism of creating jobs. The Sumter nuclear power plant in Fairfield County, which is now a very expensive hole in the ground. They were prophetic about this. The Savannah River site has had problems. They predicted that the workers were not being sufficiently protected from harm to their health. They predicted that the Savannah River site was not taking care of the waste products from the power plant sufficiently. They predicted that the toxic waste dumps would, in the short term, provide maybe some jobs and some money for the owners of the dumps, but in the long term, it would be a public policy deficit. So it's interesting to see this, and I just want to close this part of the discussion by saying it is also an example of how groups like the League of Women Voters, who work on issues that are difficult, some people might consider them boring, they're very technical, very tedious, very detailed. They did it for decades, but it is exactly those issues that make a big, big difference in the future of a community. Now I want to turn to the topic of race. Okay. In South Carolina, almost everything is about race, okay? And the inequalities and the poverty and the systematic lack of power that some people have in South Carolina. The League of Women Voters, in its history, in its 100-year history, for most of its history, it was officially a segregated organization. And that needs to be put out there and owned and acknowledged. That's how it was. It was a segregated institution. Some of its founders, like Eulalie Sally, did things that entrenched that. They were progressive in some ways and open-minded in some ways, but they were status quo oriented when it came to the racial system in South Carolina. So Eulalie Sally, for example, when the League started in 1920, some state leagues had African-American members. The South Carolina League was officially white only. There was pressure at the national level for that to change and for states all over the country not to do that. Eulalie Sally saw that there was a movement to reform the segregation, and the National League established a committee that was very awkwardly called the Committee on the, quote, Negro Question, unquote, which is interesting because Negroes were what they called Negroes at the time were not the problem. Excuse me, it was the Negro problem, unquote. Negroes were not the problem, it was the white people who were the problem. But this is like in feminist theory when people name things, but it's actually the reversal of what is actually going on. The problem was white racism and white supremacy thinking. So Eulalie Sally was on the national board. She made sure she was on that committee. She made sure that the bylaws of that committee stipulated that only state leagues that had a certain high percent of African Americans in the population of the state, not in the population of the league, because after all, the South Carolina League had 0 African Americans in the league. Only leagues with high percents of African Americans in the population could be in the committee on, quote, the Negro problem, unquote. This meant that southeastern states were in that committee, dominated it, and made sure that reforms did not happen. Now, at the same time, things start to change, right? Okay, it always starts to change. So with school desegregation, you saw a different attitude, okay? And with also the 1965 Voting Rights Act and then reapportionment, Baker versus Carr, there were different attitudes. And the League of Women Voters in South Carolina was in favor of those reforms, okay? In favor of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and fair redistricting after Baker versus Carr shortly thereafter. Some of the people in the league saw that it would be very important that implementation of the 1965 Voting Rights Act be monitored at the grassroots level. Who's more grassroots than the League of Women Voters? Not many groups. So the Spartanburg League and the Charleston League at that time, okay, in the late 50s, early 1960s, were assigned the task of monitoring and documenting the implementation of the 1965 Voting Rights Act and reapportionment in their communities and reporting malfeasance and errors and injustices in those domains. And also at the one of the presidents of the league, Barbara Moxon, in 1972, she and the whole league started to work in 1972 to remove the Confederate flag from the state capitol. Okay, and they knew that it wasn't a neutral symbol, okay? And they did that until it came down. And the coalition for that grew and grew. But the League was one of the groups in 1972 that was part of that. Okay, so now we also know that though race is very endemic and baked in South Carolina, and it's been a hard journey to break apart the segregated nature of the League of Women Voters. And in this day and age, there's a lot of hope and promise for that. And we have a very strong diversity statement right now to work toward more diversity and inclusion and engagement. So I want to sum up by saying, you can see in this history, okay, in our shoes, the detailed, fine-grained nature of how a group like this operates on the ground, okay, in the communities, at the county level, at the city level, with the ethics reform, with the Constitution, with the implementation of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. If you combine this wonderful book with other books that are now coming out about, like the League of Women Voters and African American women, or about other women's civic organizations, you can get the information about what happened at the ground level in books like this one, and then at the national level. And you see that these institutions were not monoliths. They were internally pushing, even in 1920, for racial change at the national level, but not in the Southeast. You can see also that a group like the League is very aware that it is the structural work, the detailed work, that will do the most to make democracy work. And that structural work, like fair districting, one of our new issues, that structural work is the kind of work that will alleviate some of the pain that people experience with poverty, with injustices, with lack of opportunities, and maybe with schools that are not adequate for their children's futures. So the League does both things, and you can see it in this book. It does the structural work, and it does the detailed on the ground work. So thank you, Sheila, for this wonderful book, and for adding to the very deserved history of women in politics, which is often not appreciated and celebrated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So I hope that enhanced your appetite for the book. Let me tell you a little bit about getting your own very personal copy. Now, you can order it from Amazon, and if you want an electronic edition, that's the best thing to do. It's very inexpensive. It's $3.59 in a Kindle book. But if you want something like me that you can hold in your hands and turn the pages of and pass around to your friends, I recommend that you get the paperback copy. Again, you can order it from Amazon, but we are encouraging you not to order it from Amazon, but to buy it either through your local league or through your state league. And the reason for that is that we get to buy copies at what's called the author rate. Only the South Carolina League of Women Voters can buy at this price. And then our total profit is about $10 a copy. It sells for $15. So if you buy it from your local league, they get half, state league gets half. If you buy it from our website, the LWVSC website, you can do that and order it with PayPal, and we'll get sent to you directly. And then all of the profits of that go to the state league. So if you have a state league that's selling it, we encourage you to buy it from them. If you don't live in an area with a state league, or you're in a big hurry to get a copy, since I should have mine today, order it on the state league website and we'll send it to you. We hope that you'll have groups reading it. When my local board was discussing the book, one of our members said, how many should they order? Well, how many board members we have? Well, maybe not every board member wants one. And one of them says, I don't believe you should be on the board of the league if you haven't read its history. So I have to endorse that one. I also want to go back to the comments of Laura about race. We're very aware of the importance of racial issues in all of the work that we do, whether it's electoral democracy or environment or education or effective government. And so we have recently appointed an African-American member to our state board with the specific task of addressing racial justice in our advocacy work. And she's going to work very closely with Lynn Teague, our lobbyist. So you'll be hearing more from Trish Montgomery about our efforts to be a truly inclusive community, and from Charmaine Clowney in Columbia, who helps us internally become more inclusive. So watch for that, read the book, do good work, be safe. Thank you.